Hey, good morning, Moms and Master Books. Hope you're having a fantastic week. Hey, today I am here with author Angela Odell. She is the author of our Math Lessons for a Living Education, which has quickly become one of our best-selling series. She is the author of America's Story, which is a fantastic American history for elementary age students, but can also be adapted for multiple grades. And she's the author of The World Story, which has just, the final one, book 3, has just come out, and the teacher guide was hot off the press. Was it last week? I think it was pretty last week or the week before. If you don't know me, my name is Randy Pratt. I'm the marketing genius behind Master Books. I operate the magic here at Master Books. So, so Angela, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. This is fun.
This is a little different format than we've done for a while. We used to do it this way back in the day when Katie was here. And Katie was a much, she presented better in this format than I do, but we need information, so we're going to do what it takes to get information. So World Story 3 is right off. With World Story, what would you say is the heart behind the series? Like if you had to do kind of an elevator pitch sum up, what would you say is the heart behind the series for World Story 3? Or World Story total, the whole series?
World series. I would have to say that my intent was to give a pretty good, solid overview. I mean, let's be honest. We could study history our entire lives, and we would never know everything about history. So I guess the heart behind it would be me wanting to give the student a good solid overview, but also show them along the way how worldview affects history and how it actually causes the different things in history to happen, the different worldviews of whole cultures, individuals, whatever. But also for the student to understand their place in history, how they are not disconnected from the past in any way. We're all part of history, and that would probably be my number one thing, is for them to see themselves and to see God in history, and to understand that they are actually in a very important part of history themselves.
Yeah. So many history, the way we approach history is so important. I agree. And so many times people approach it as facts and figures, but they don't really understand that God is telling this incredible story of redemption, and he's using the world events. You know, like Genghis Khan says, hey, you must have done something wrong for God to send me as your judgment, because, you know, this is like, I'm an agent of God right now bringing upon judgment.
Right.
There's that worldview is so important, and it's not in every history. It's not taught to students to really look at what was the underlying worldview, what is God doing in the world at this time, because I think we're about to come into some interesting times in our culture. A lot of prophecies are being fulfilled, a lot of things are happening. We need to know what the worldview is of the leaders who are in place, but also what is God doing in his story that is, you know, that's what it's all about. And I think you even say that this is his story. It's not
Right.
It's not man's story. It's his story, and his story and his creation. So, so the term Charlotte Mason, we say Charlotte Mason influenced. Sometimes Charlotte Mason purists will say you shouldn't say that. I would say the only true Charlotte Mason purist was Charlotte herself over 100 years ago. Everybody else is an imitation in one form or another. I would call Master Books a progressive Charlotte Mason approach, in that there's been 100 years of research, and over 100 years of research. And in the homeschool community, especially because we're homeschooling our own children in our own homes, it has to be adapted to fit a different style. So as a progressive Charlotte Mason company, and you have the Charlotte Mason influence, can you address that approach with World Story 3? Because that one seems to be a little less Charlotte Mason-y than, say, World Story 1 or even the math.
Yeah, I would say that Charlotte Mason had some very sound philosophy when it comes to approaching children in some ways. In other ways, like you said, we have gained a lot of knowledge since her time here. And also, I'd like to add into that equation that Charlotte Mason was never married, and she was never a mom, let alone a homeschooler. So we are in a completely different type of setting than Charlotte Mason ever was. We cannot use everything that she set forth as sound truth for raising and educating children. We just can't do that. We can't do that for anybody, though. We have to be dependent upon the leading of the Holy Spirit. And I don't know about you, Randy, but I would rather follow the leading of the Holy Spirit within me, who knows what's going on in the world right now, than some dead lady from 100 years ago. I'm sorry, I don't mean any disrespect to her, but I would rather trust that than her. So
Right.
Anyway, back to, I can't even remember what your original question was. Wait a minute, hold on, let me think. Oh yes, this series. Okay. I would say, yeah, it is a little bit less Charlotte Mason-y than the younger, just simply because the students nowadays are needing they're needing to be in a different place than students their age 100 years ago. They need to know and be ready to step into what God has created for them since the beginning. And in doing that, I didn't feel like I could really stick to the the written narration. What did you gain from this? I wanted to make sure that they were actually really gleaning what I needed them to glean from it. With the Charlotte Mason approach, it really does leave on the child the responsibility to learn for themselves, which is a good thing, and but it's more open-ended. It's more here. What did you learn from this? That's great. That's wonderful. Now let's move on. With this series, I wanted the kids to be able to tell me what are the most important things, and to be able to actually check that off. Mm-hmm. The worldview. I wanted them to understand that the worldview that is woven through history and therefore in these books, I wanted to make sure they were grasping that and how it applied to themselves. And I didn't feel like I could really do that with an open-ended, what do you think about this? Does that make sense?
Yep.
I wanted it to be a little bit more guided in the sense of coming out on the other end, really understanding the important things that were worked through this series. So you'll still see a lot of the Charlotte Mason flavor to it, as in the way it's written. It's a narrative voice. Mm-hmm. But the actual work that goes with it is a bit more intense, and it's a bit more guided than the America story. The America story is like, use your imagination, imagine you're here, imagine you're there, whatever. But and that's good for that age group. But this is definitely for an older group.
Yeah, with the Master Books method, we tend to about junior high is when we start to transition them more towards a more traditional approach. And a lot of that, I know some people are like, well, we like the Charlotte Mason approach, and I think it works phenomenal for teaching critical thinking skills, laying foundations for younger students. The challenge we have is to prepare our children, though, for a world that is not Charlotte Mason in college and beyond. Any course certification or anything else. So it's really kind of a transition from more of a simple, childish Charlotte Mason to a more traditional education approach.
And also, just as a side note, I'm very familiar with how Charlotte Mason taught junior high and up, and quite honestly, she herself transitions. But the way she approaches those ages, I don't see that almost anything that she does. I don't see how it would prepare our students for what they are facing. Just simply because she's very heavy into the classic literatures and all of those things that take a ton of time. Mm-hmm. Some families are fine with that, and they don't mind spending that amount of time studying the classics and studying all of the philosophy and all of that other stuff. For myself and the students that I teach, I feel like it is better to use that time preparing them for what they're actually going to face. What are the cultural issues today? What does God say about them? And where should we stand in the truth so that we can be this generation's light in the dark?
Right.
And that's really where I veer very sharply away from the Charlotte Mason method. I do not, like I've said before, I'm much more of the Hebrew model of education than the classical, just because I believe that it's more important to get to the heart and the spirit of the child.
Yeah. So we're not saying it's a Charlotte Mason approach, exclusive, pure Charlotte Mason approach. There are things that we take from it. This course, so I've got the World Story 3, which is the Explorers to the Present Age. These are the books that are now in stock, and the series is complete with the 3 levels. This follows the Master Books method. So there's a student textbook, which has the reading in it. Then there's the teacher guide. A teacher guide is called a teacher guide because it has answers in it, and it has quizzes in it. And you wouldn't give the student this full book. So it's for the teacher to decide how to administer it to the student. So it's a teacher guide. It has a daily schedule in the beginning. It has student activity sheets throughout. Are there manipulatives in the back? I think like a timeline or anything? There's
some. A timeline project, yeah.
Okay. It has the answer key and everything that you need in this book. So it's a 2-book set. There's 2 books for each level. So talk about, this is a little different because it's not a weekly format. It's like a 6-day cycle. So can you just kind of lay out the 6-day cycle?
Sure. Well, the student's going to read, and then there are a couple of the pages that they actually do while they're reading, and it has to do with the vocabulary and the, I think the mapping is afterwards. So this definitely the vocabulary. We changed up the volume 3 just slightly from the other 2. It's a very similar routine, but it's slightly different. I replaced a couple of the pages with some new activities. I'll talk about World Story 3 in particular this time. So they have the vocabulary. Well, the first page is the kind of the week at a glance. As for the teacher to know what kind of materials, what activities their student's going to be doing, so they don't have to go through and look every single page. I think the next page is the vocabulary, and I don't have a hard copy of that yet, so I'm having to kind of pull from memory of when I put it together. So the vocabulary page, and then what comes after that on a general basis, Randy?
Well, let's see. From the teacher guide or the student book?
From the teacher guide. You have the week at a glance, and then you have the look at the activity, the teacher guide.
So in the teacher guide,
Teacher guide.
It has...
So you have the week at a glance, and then is the next page the vocabulary page on each week section, or each
so materials section. Needed. Day 1, a written narration prompt and vocabulary.
Okay, that's what it was. The written narration prompt. And in number 3, the written narration prompt is sometimes an open-ended and sometimes it's a guided.
Okay.
Sometimes I tell them specifically what I want them to do. When there's something very important that I want to call their attention to, but yet I want to give them some creative license in it. That's what I'll do there. And then there's a vocabulary section, and sometimes those are open-ended, and sometimes, like on the chapters about the Enlightenment, I actually have them do guided vocabulary because I really want them to understand the meaning of the vocabulary in that specific chapter. And then what's on the next page? Is that the World Quest page?
World Quest would be day 3. So they would do those two kind of day 1, day 2, Monday, Tuesday, or however. Then day 3 would be World Quest.
And those in that volume, those tend to be a little bit more in depth. Those are more of an essay type question. And sometimes I actually have one of them as a kind of a character sketch where I want them to really look at a person in the chapter, where I don't want them just kind of skipping over it. I want them to take time to really look at it and look at their life. And it's not a very big assignment, but it's a more in-depth and more guided assignment.
So a couple of the questions would be from that page would be like, name 2 reasons I gave the chapter that some historians call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages. Who is Ptolemy? What we're missing in his maps? Those type of questions.
Right.
And then there's a worldview checkup. The next
page is the worldview checkup.
Yep.
And that's the different one in this. In volume 3, that's something that's new. And those pages kind of some of those pages are more open-ended and some of them are more guided, but I want them to analyze the worldview that has caused that historical event, or that the historical event caused to shift the worldview.
Okay.
So, and then there is
the map adventure.
The map adventure, and then the next one is that the abandoned places on the back side of the map?
Let's see, map adventure, yes.
Okay,
yep.
So that's also a new feature in this particular volume, is that I really, really wanted to pull in some of my kids' favorite things in history is to look at the abandoned places of history. And the world is full of all kinds of really amazing, kind of creepy, just fascinating places that have been abandoned, but they have been used in history, or they represent a time in history that the kids have already studied. So it's not just this fun, oh, let's look at this abandoned place. Isn't that so cool? That's so creepy. It's more of okay, guys, look, this is during this time, and I think the first one was the what is that first one?
Dry Tortugas, Key West, Florida.
Okay, so when I was researching for this book, I myself have this huge, thick book about abandoned places all over the world. And so my kids and I have pored over that book for several years, and it's just totally fascinating. But I told Craig Froman that I really needed some fresh abandoned places for this book. So he sent me this link to this fascinating, it's like this encyclopedia online of all these abandoned places all over the world. So what I do is I have the kids, I tell the kids where they are, where the abandoned place is, what its connection is to history. Like that particular one is, I don't want to do any spoilers, but there's this completely awesome and cool connection to American history that they're going to be, if they like history at all, they're going to flip over it, because I flipped over it. I didn't even realize this connection. I knew about this place, but I did not realize that connection. And that connection is what I'm really working for in this whole book, because this is the modern times. The kids can connect to it a little bit differently, because it's not so far back that they don't know anything about it, that it has a little bit more to do with our lives. And that reminds me, Randy, that that whole connection thing, there is a new feature in the student book. In every chapter, there's a little feature called New to Known.
Okay.
And what it does is I pull in, okay, so during this time period of when this was happening in history, during that time period, this was also happening. So, like during, I can't even pull one up out of my head right now, but like it'll have like this little, it's this nice little graphic that they came up with, that it'll say during this time period that this was happening in the world, this was happening in the United States, or another well-known historical event, so that it connects it for the child, for the student.
So one in the first chapter is new to known, the natives of North American continents were descendants of the people who came after the dispersion of people at the Tower of Babel. In the year Coronado led his expedition through what is now southwestern part of the United States, King Henry VIII was still on the throne in England. His rule ended about 7 years later in January of 1547. So it kind of gives some other perspective in history.
Right. So it connects those things that they may be familiar with or something that they just studied to that same period, so that they're starting to not just have a whole bunch of these random events strung out. And that happens with a lot of students. They're not really connecting the dots. Okay, so while this was happening, and so that feature was pulled in.
Yeah.
And also the abandoned places. They're all through that book, and there are just some really fascinating ones in there.
That's awesome. And then day 6 is the timeline, and then digging deeper. Mm-hmm. So timeline.
Yes, and about the timeline, we did keep the way that we've been doing it in the World Story series, but in this one I added in the back the directions on how to make a master timeline for the entire book, mm-hmm. so that they would be able to, if they wanted to do that, they could create their just kind of a flow of what was going on in the whole story. So
one of the things I like, America's Story uses a horizontal timeline, which is traditionally what we see, but I do like the shift a little bit to the vertical timeline, just because it forces the student to have a different context, a different thought. It's still good. I love the horizontal timeline because that just makes everything easy. Yep. So a family can easily do that on their own, or use something like Adam's Chart of History or something like that to do it. But I do like having a little different context sometimes, that a student has to go, oh wait, that's different. How do I make sense of this?
Yeah, it kind of kicks it into that higher thinking level.
Yes. Okay, so let's do a brief synopsis of each level, kind of what the main takeaway is you want for the student. So the first series was Creation to the Roman Empire. What's the overall takeaway that you want a student to get from that first book?
That the Bible is history. The Bible is history, and it is the only infallible source of history ever known to man. So when I went about to write that book, and that book I wrote, that one was in 2012 or 13 or something like that, the original version. I didn't want it to be a story of random facts all kind of pushed together where everything was equal. We as Christians believe that the Bible is above all other books. It is Holy Spirit breathed. And what an opportunity to be able to write about the happenings of the world during that time period. Mm-hmm. And so I used the Bible as the spine for that book. And there is Bible reading assigned throughout that book. And because I wanted the student to, I know so many people, and I am included in this crowd, that we went through school and this is world history and this was Bible, and they don't go together. Do you know, it took me, and this is embarrassing, and I'm saying this on air, okay? So just...
I don't live feed, just...
I did not realize how the Jewish people had gotten into captivity in Egypt. The Hebrews had gotten into captivity in Egypt. I wasn't, I realized how that had happened. And now that's crazy. I mean, I grew up in a weird way, but still, I had read my Bible and I studied history, and it just did not connect for me until I realized, wait a minute, they were there because Joseph was sold into slavery, and he rescued them, and it's just like I didn't want the students reading this book to have that disconnect. I wanted them to understand how it all went together. And another thing is that I wanted them to understand that the stories of the Bible, they're not on the same level. They're so far above the fables and the other things of the pagan cultures back then. I didn't want the story of Abraham being kind of thrown in between two chapters of two, some about Egyptian gods and fables and some about Greek and Roman gods and fables. I didn't want them to be, the Jewish people had this person, and then I wanted it to be above. I wanted it to be different. Mm-hmm. And I believe that when we teach our kids that that Abraham was on the same level as one of the Greek gods or Greek fabled people, we're teaching them that the stories are equal, and really, what is the next logical step in that way of thinking? That all religions lead to the same place, right? All gods are the same.
Right.
And I would rather never write another word in my entire life, and that's saying something because I have to write, than to lead one of the children to believe that. So that book is very special to me. I love the story of the ancients because it's so important to really show the kids how everything was connected and how the Bible can. There are so many archaeological finds that support the Bible. I wanted them to know that. And it not be disconnected.
A lot of people make the mistake of thinking, well, we don't really need to know Old Testament history. But the Old Testament history is a type and a shadow. When we see the Old Testament in its whole, we understand the redemptive story of us as individuals, the way God orchestrated the call of a nation and their captivity, their release, their constant rebellion and calling and obedience and that play. And then we understand that in my life and how we end up in captivity, how he delivers us and sets us free, right. How he brings us into the promised place. So understanding that chronology is so important to understanding the gospel in my life. The other thing that we miss, like military history, historians don't want to study Israeli conflicts because there's always a divine nature. So they'll study Napoleon and they'll study, Rommel and Patton and all the greats throughout history because there was a man-made component to it. But when you bring Israel into it, there's always a God deliverance component to it. And I want my kids to know that if they're in a battle, they really need to go to that place where God is, not their own doings. Because look at Israel. When God redeemed Israel and brought them into the land, and he protects them. What an amazing thing. Where's Patton? Where's Rommel? Where's Napoleon? Where are all these great men? Alexander the Great, these conquerors, where are they? But look at Israel and what God does. And so that's what I want my kids to understand. So I think his providence through history, but the way he dealt with a chosen people that now we're part of. And right. So it's so cool to have that. Okay, number 2, the second level is the fall of Rome through the Renaissance. What's the main takeaway there?
Well, just kind of a continuation of that story. It's not covered in the Bible, obviously, but it's the focus of that one is really how God used his people, and he stayed true to his word through every century. And yes, there were a lot of really dark things that happened. There was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of forced conversions and all of these really wicked and evil things that happened. But God still had his people. And even the church, even though the church itself became really greedy and power hungry and held a lot of sway, and the theology of the church really shifted to something that wasn't biblical, God's promise that he would have his people and he would protect his word is you can see it. It's all the way through those dark Middle Ages.
And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
What was that?
And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
That's right. So, I mean, I go into a lot of where in the first one there's apologetics through archaeology. And the second one and the third volume, we really focus on the church, the history of the church, and people who really stepped up, and like St. Patrick, and just to have the kids understand that yes, these were the dark ages, and like I say in there's a lot of reasons why they were dark. There was a lot of ignorance. A lot of people couldn't read during that time, but hang on a second.
A Marco Rubio moment right there.
Yeah, wow. We're doing reno in our house, and it's spring. So there's construction dust and pollen, and they're both trying to destroy my voice.
We'll show you grace.
So, but yes, so that's really the takeaway of that one is that God, even though it was very dark, human history was very dark culturally, God was still there, and he was still shining his light, and he still had things in control. And I'm sure that he brought a lot of people into his family during that time period that we'll never know about because it wasn't written down. So that was an interesting period to write about because I knew quite a bit about it, but doing a lot of research to fill in holes, it really showed up a lot of very huge differences in opinions about what had actually happened during that time period. So that was very interesting to try to figure out, from what angle should I approach this?
Right.
It's very interesting.
Get that question often, and something I would say is all of history is subjective. And
absolutely.
We just did this we're doing this Facebook Live. If I go back to my office and I write out the way it went and how it happened, and if you went and did the same thing and you wrote an account of what happened, you'd probably be stuck on the word marketing genius and stuff like that. But we'd have two different opinions about what occurred. And we would be the eyewitnesses, right? And Brittany, who's in the room with me as well, if she wrote one, she'd have a third opinion about it, and she'd remember different things. Well, bring that forward 1,000 years. It's going to change drastically. And so we do the best we can with history to be as objective as possible and cover the views. But all of history is subjective, and there is really no way of, apart from God's word where he preserved what happened, there's no way of having humans retell something without bringing their biases, their worldview, all of these things into play. So I think you do a really good job of keeping a very biblical perspective and objective. I think you cover both sides of a lot of things. So it's not politically correct, but you try to be fair to history. But at the same time, there is no history that's not subjective. It just isn't. I don't see how it's possible.
I know, and it's so funny because in this last volume that I was writing, I have a ton of resources that I pulled from that were written during the events happening. For example, World War I have a set of books. It's literally a blow-by-blow of World War I. Of course, it wasn't called World War I. It was the Great War. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I'm comparing this set of books, and it's a series of like 5 or 6 books, it's volumes, and it is seriously a blow-by-blow story of World War I. It's written from the British It's a British author. And I'm looking at that and I'm comparing it to another resource, an Usborne book. And I'm going, same event, same person, both sides. This is incredible, the difference between these two. Which one is correct? Well, you would think the one that was written during the time period would probably be a little bit more accurate than the one that was written so many years later. But I was just kind of like going, but this is what we deal with in history.
Right.
This is what we deal with.
And even that, right, we would think that the most accurate would be the one that we're in, but they don't always have access to all the information that comes out later. So it's a hard deal.
Bias.
Yes.
There's a bias.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, number 3, the explorers to the present day. And can I say, I think a lot of homeschoolers get stuck in the creation to Christ or the ancients mode, and they don't mature out of, they get bored, and they don't mature out. And then maybe they'll do Renaissance and some of the Middle Ages, but present day is so important because so many major philosophies that are shaping culture right now were developed during this time frame. So that's something as homeschoolers, I would just challenge you, don't neglect the modern age, because it is so important that your students understand who are the players that really laid the worldview that the stage is playing on right now. So what would be your main takeaway?
Wow, you just stole my thunder. The the modern ages are, all of history has led up to this point, but the most pertinent to our lives right now, I really believe, is the Enlightenment till now. That whole period of and like I say in the book, some of the stuff needed to happen. Kings needed to have their absolute power taken away, for crying out loud. They didn't need to be able to be tyrants and do whatever they felt like doing in the name of God. Mm-hmm. And that's what they used to do. So they needed to have that whittled down a bit. But along with that came the questioning of God. And where does wisdom come from? Where does knowledge come from? And slowly but surely, the whole world culture has turned from, the church and God being at the absolute authority to there is no authority, there is no baseline of truth, and to each person is their own God. Mm-hmm. So that this period, the modern period, period is really that pivot point. And because of that, there's this whole huge grinding of the world cultures. There's all the revolutions, there's the wars, there's the different types of government that have come into play. And this is a hugely significant time period that I really believe that everybody needs to study at least 1 year of, just because it really does determine where we are in our world culture right now.
And we're so in a pivotal spot. If those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. And right now there are so many things linked to culture that we can see other cultures who follow the same routes that we're on, what happens, and even navigating that. But again, understanding that God is always accomplishing his purpose and his mission, and nothing's going to happen that he doesn't ordain or allow, with the intent to always bring us back to himself. I mean, it's been that way in every culture. When culture gets too big for their britches, he reminds them who's God and who's seated on the throne. So, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk, I'm going long, but let's talk a little bit competition. In the homeschool market, of course, we have the traditional approaches, and we'll let them go. But there's two main that people would tend to gravitate towards that this would be competing against, so to speak. One would be Mystery of History. And Mystery of History, I think, follows it's a very creation-based. She does a really good job of tying the Bible in, God's purposes, and all of that. I think it's probably a little more heavy if you did everything, it would be a little bit more, it could be a lot for a parent to do everything. And there's four books in that series. How would you compare, a quick synopsis of Mystery of History to the World Story?
Mystery of History, yeah, you're right. It is very biblically sound, and I appreciate that. I would have to say that it's just a different style. It's a different style of curriculum. Mm-hmm. It's more of a it's a bigger smorgasbord. And like you said, if you tried to do everything, it would be really heavy. But you don't have to do everything, obviously.
Right.
But it's just a bigger smorgasbord. I would have to say that the world story compared to that it's more streamlined, and it's more it has all the same information, but I would have to say it's more streamlined. It's more of a more direct approach where you can move through it a little bit more easily. And also you have to take in consideration the Mystery of History has, I think is it the 4 volumes? Is
right.
it the ancient, medieval? So yeah, she split it into 4, where mine is in 3. So it's just a bit more, bigger, a bigger feast, shall we say?
And I think that the World Story follows a very apologetic nature as well, because it's right. staying very close to the worldview concept and what was happening with worldviews and how it shaped history. Not that Mystery of History doesn't. I think that that's an excellent course for Christian homeschoolers because it follows very closely with what we would have. Okay, Story of the World. That's another one that is very popular among homeschoolers, but there's a definite difference between the two.
Yes. The worldview.
Yes.
Just foundationally, the worldview is completely different. There also, I think there are the 4 volumes, where mine is the 3. And then, but the worldview, honestly, is the biggest difference. The curriculum style is probably a little bit more similar than the Mystery of History, in the sense that it has the book and then the activity pages that go with it. But the way it's written is completely different. It's much more secular, and there's the worldview is completely opposite.
If you had to look at a bias, I would kind of say you could lump Mystery of History very closely along with our world story, in that it tries to understand man in relationship to God and how history was occurring. Story of the World, I would say, would be very much more, it's the history of man from man's point of view, and while there may be some incorporation of God, it's more of a man-centered approach than a God-centered approach to history. So the two would be there, and we would always, from Master Book's perspective, we always want to go from God's word outwards. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Going from knowledge to God, to me, just never makes sense, because God doesn't fit into context of man's knowledge. No. So that would probably be some of the differences that I would see as well. Okay. Customization, we designed it, we twisted Angela's arm a little bit and said we need to have some grade levels. So their grade ranges. America's Story is not a prerequisite to the world story. It can be done at any time. We have a lot of people in high school who will actually combine all 3 American Story for an American history. They'll combine all 3 world story for a world history. They will also not use the student books, the teacher guides, for everything, and they'll use them as readers, as read-alouds. Some people are using World Story for lower elementary and just using it as a read-aloud and discussion. So there's a lot of adaptability in it. We give kind of a grade range that it's targeted to and most appropriate for, and this is important, it's most appropriate for independent learning, so that you could hand it to the student and the student could figure out the majority of it or the bulk of it independently. If you're going to adapt it, it may require just a little bit more teacher involvement, parent involvement, to make it like if you take World Story and use it with an elementary student, you're going to need to be a little bit more involved because some of the concepts, the way it's written, is designed for an older student. Would you agree?
And Randy, I would like to say also that Volume 3 of the World Story, I don't recommend that for anybody under 6th grade. I really don't. I mean, honestly, it's not going to hurt to read it around your younger kids, but to actually try to use that as a history for younger, there are some really, really big and heavy concepts and events that happened, and the things that I cover in that book, they're really just not appropriate for the younger kids. So I just want to put that out there.
Okay. So, and again, our purpose, our mission statement is ink on paper to impact eternity. And so when we do a book like this or a series like this, and we commit to a project with an author like Angela, our goal isn't just to teach history so that they can pass ACTs and SATs or you know, fill out a checkbox for the state regulation. We want to accomplish more than that. We want world changers. We want people who actually understand their relationship to God, His creation, their relationship to creation and to God, and that they are called to advance His kingdom. And they have to understand the playing field. And so that's why it's important for us to really start training students and equipping them with it, not just facts and figures and information. Would you agree?
Amen.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you joining me in this format, and it is an awesome privilege to work with you. Could you put your hands up like this? Yeah, see, your fingernails kind of matched your shirt, and I've been catching glimpses of it, and I thought, you know what, moms of master books may actually appreciate how color coordinated you are. Only here. Hey, I'm going to pray. Is it okay if I pray for you? And I'm going to pray for the students that use this course.
I'd appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, Father, I thank you for Angela. I thank you for the blessing that she is to Master Books and to the homeschool community at large. And I just pray your continued blessing and inspiration and creativity on her. And Father, for each student who takes up this course, I just pray that you would do mighty work in them, that you would equip them and prepare them for everything that you call them to be, to advance your kingdom and the message of the cross and your Son, Jesus Christ. To you be all glory, honor, and praise. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Moms of Master Books, it is a privilege and an honor to serve you and to be part of this community. And so be sure to post any questions you have, and we'll try to go through. Angela's also can jump on the post and answer some questions personally. It's one of the privileges we have here in this group is that the authors agree to participate, and we're so privileged by that. And we just pray you have a blessed day. On Thursday in Teaching Tips, Lord willing, we're going to be talking about part 2 of helping your child be in better brain, and it's really about perspective. The laying a foundation of perspective that begins with us. So we'll talk more about that on Thursday. I hope to see you there. And thanks again, Angela. It's always a pleasure. God bless you guys.